Let's talk now about the idea of indifference curves. And the indifference curve concept comes from the concept of utility. So if you think about how economists measure the satisfaction that you get from consuming some product, at its most basic level, we measure it by looking at the amount of utility that you get from consuming the goods. So we're going to use this word utility to think of, we're going to think of it as being synonymous with the word satisfaction. Okay, so if you consume some product, it makes you better off, and we're going to describe the being made better off by saying that you get more utility. So what we're going to think about is what we're going to call a utility function. So a utility function is going to measure mathematically the well-being of the consumer. So this idea of utility, that's just consumer well-being. Okay, so we're going to be measuring utility using a mathematical function. Now, we're not going to get into the mathematics of it. That's beyond the undergraduate level. But if we wanted to, we could think about a general function. And so we could call that function U, and it's going to be a function of the two goods that the consumer is going to consume. So for now, I'm going to think about the two goods, just for this discussion, as being X and Y. Once we get through this utility function discussion and the indifference curve discussion, we'll switch back to using maybe the amount of cloth and the amount of food that you consume. But for right now, let's talk about the two goods as if they're just X and Y. So these are the goods. The consumer consumes them and gets some utility, and we're going to measure the amount of utility with this mathematical function. I'm just calling it U. It's just being represented by the U with the parentheses there. And it's going to spit out some number. So let me give you some examples. This is actually a very simple idea. Right now it may seem weird, but let me give you an example of utility functions. So a possible utility function might be X times Y. That could be a utility function. So let's suppose the consumer consumes 2 units of good X and 3 units of good Y. If we plug those numbers in here, it's going to be 2 times 3. The amount of utility that the consumer would get would be 6 units. It's what we call utils. Okay? If the consumer consumed more X and more Y, we would expect that they would be made better off. They get more well-being if you consume more of the goods. So if we plugged in, say, X equals 4 and Y equals 4, then the consumer would get 16 utils out of that. They were made even better off. So that's one possible utility function. Another possible utility function might be X plus Y. And that would give us a different set of numbers there. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, but that's a utility function just like this one. Another utility function, actually a very common utility function, is one that we call a Cobb-Douglas utility function, and it looks like this. X raised to the 1/2 power times Y to the 1/2 power. Remember that anytime you raise something to the 1/2 power, all you're doing is taking the square root of it. Okay? So this is the square root of X multiplied by the square root of Y. And you can see that we could plug those numbers into this utility function and it would give us some measure, some number for U. So let's talk for just a second about marginal utility. You've probably heard that term discussed in a previous economics class. But the idea behind marginal utility, let's say the marginal utility of consuming good X, the marginal utility of X would be the additional utility that you get from consuming one more unit of X. So the marginal utility of good X would be the change in utility when you change the quantity of good X that you're consuming. And we're going to be thinking about this as changing it by 1 unit. Okay, so it's the change in utility when you change good X. The marginal utility of good Y, as you can imagine, would be the change in utility when you change Y. When you increase Y by 1 unit, how much more utility do you get? So we'll talk about those here in a little bit, but that's what the marginal utility looks like. Let's talk about how we're going to use these numbers, these things that we're calling utils. So the way that we think about this, let's suppose that we have 3 bundles. Let's suppose that we have bundle A, bundle B, and bundle C. A bundle is just the term that I'm going to use to refer to a particular amount of X and a particular amount of Y. So this would be a bundle. X equals 2, Y equals 3. This would be a different bundle. X equals 4, Y equals 4. So let's think about 3 different bundles. And let's suppose that when we plug the numbers from those bundles for good X and good Y into our utility function, let's suppose that good A, let's suppose we get 6 utils from good A. If the consumer consumed bundle A, I shouldn't have said good A, it's bundle A. If the consumer consumes bundle A, they're going to get 6 utils. If they consume bundle B, let's suppose they get 4 utils. And if they consume bundle C, let's suppose they get 12 utils. So let's think about how we're going to use that information. So if we ask the consumer to rank these bundles in terms of how much they liked them, how much well-being each bundle provided them with, the consumer would rank these bundles as C, giving them the greatest amount of well-being, right? And then the next bundle would be A, and then the next bundle would be B. That would be the ranking that the consumer would provide us. So if we asked them, which bundle do you like best? They would say, I like bundle C best. And if we said, which bundle do you like least? They would say bundle B. Now, we get this ranking, and that's really the only thing that we're going to use the utility function for. We don't really care about these numbers. The only thing, not the absolute magnitude of those numbers. The only thing we care about is which of them is biggest. We care about the ranking here. So we would get the same outcome. We would get the same outcome if from our 3 bundles, let's put our bundles up here, A, B, and C, we would get the exact same outcome if from bundle A we got, say, 14 utils, and bundle B we got, say, 2 utils, and then from bundle C the consumer got, say, 101 utils. The utility function that generates these numbers would give us the exact same ranking of bundles for the consumer as this utility function that gives us these. So the point of this is all we care about is the ranking. We do not care about the magnitude of these numbers. What this means is that a utility function is simply an ordinal. It provides us with an ordinal ranking. Okay, that's all we care about with the utility function, is we care about the order that the consumer would put these bundles in. We do not care about what's referred to as the cardinal ranking. So we can also have a cardinal ranking. A cardinal ranking is a ranking where the difference between these numbers tells us something. So for example, if we were going to use the utility function to provide us with a cardinal ranking, here's what we would be able to do. We would be able to say that this consumer likes bundle C twice as much as they like bundle A, because they get twice as many utils from bundle C as they do from bundle A. But we do not use the utility function that way. So just keep in mind that a utility function does not give us a cardinal ranking. All it gives us is an ordinal ranking. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that we can't compare the utils that one person gets from consuming bundle A to the utils that another person gets from consuming bundle A. So for example, we could treat this not as two different utility functions, but two different people. Let's suppose this person's utility function, when we plugged these bundles into their utility function, it gave us these numbers. And then this was a different person. And when we plugged in the amounts for the bundles into this person's utility function, it gave us these numbers. We would never say anything like person A, or this person likes bundle A more than this person. We would not make interpersonal comparisons. All we care about is the ranking. If these were two different people, all we would say is these two people have the same ordering of preferences in terms of those bundles. So that's how we're going to treat the utility function. Okay? It gives us an ordinal ranking, not a cardinal ranking. And we're going to treat the number as if it represents some measure of the well-being that they get, but we don't place much significance on the actual number itself. So what I need to do is clear this off, and then we'll use this idea to talk about what's known as an indifference curve. All right, let's talk about the idea of an indifference curve. Let's pick a couple of goods to kind of use in this discussion. Let's think about maybe books and movies. And we're going to think about a situation where there are only two goods, like we typically do. Let's look at a picture of how many books and how many movies we're going to be consuming. So let's put movies down here on our horizontal axis. Let's put books up here. Move that down. And let's put some tick marks on our axes here. So let's make these go up by 5. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. And let's do the same thing with our horizontal axis. Let's say 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So let's pick a bundle to start with. Let's start with a situation where we have, let's say, 15 books and 10 movies. We'll call that point A. Okay, so we're going to start with point A. And we want to think about how the consumer would like other combinations of books and movies compared to point A. So there are some easy things that we can make, some comparisons that we can make. We know that consumers are going to want to consume more of the goods rather than less. So one of the assumptions that we're implicitly making here is that these are goods. And economists call a good because it's good, right? Because it gives us well-being. Otherwise, those things that we have out there that provide us with, that make us worse off, as you can imagine, we call those bads. Okay, so these are goods because we like to consume them. And so that one of the assumptions we're going to make is that more is better than less. Okay, so we can say that compared to point A, the consumer would like point A more than any of the bundles that are down here in this space right here. Because any bundle down in this space would have less books and less movies. We can also say something about any bundle to the northeast of A up here. We could say that the consumer would like a bundle out here more than they would like bundle A, because a bundle out here, that bundle would have more books and more movies. So we can say something about these bundles and we can say something about these bundles, but we can't say much yet about these bundles up here or the bundles down here, because a bundle up here has more books than bundle A, but fewer movies. And so it depends on how much the consumer likes books compared to movies. And a bundle down here has more movies, but fewer books than bundle A. So again, it depends on how much the consumer likes books relative to movies as to whether or not they would like a particular bundle out here more or less than bundle A. But what we can do is we can think about taking some books away from the consumer. Let's suppose that we take 5 books away from the consumer. So we're going to move down to right here, where now they're going to have 10 books instead of 15. We can think about taking 5 books away and then giving them enough movies to where they like this new bundle the exact same amount as they liked bundle A. Okay? So let's suppose if we take 5 books away from the consumer, let's suppose that they need, say, 6 movies to be just as happy as they were at bundle A. So that's going to be a point right out here where we've got 16 movies. That's bundle B. Let's call it bundle B. So we're thinking about this thought experiment where we take a certain amount of books away from the consumer, but we compensate them for that loss with additional movies. And so our consumer says, okay, if you take 5 books away, you need to give me 6 movies, and then I will not care whether I'm at point A or point B. So what we found there is a bundle, another bundle, bundle B, such that the consumer is indifferent between bundle A and bundle B. They do not care whether they're here or whether they're here. If we were, what this means in terms of our utility function is, if we were to take this bundle where they've got 15 books and 10 movies and plug it into the utility function, out of that would pop a number of utils. And then if we were to take this bundle where they've got 10 books and 16 movies and plug that into the utility function, it would give us the exact same number of utils. So points A and points B, bundle A and B, give us the same number of utils from our utility function. The consumer is completely indifferent between the 2 bundles. Let's think about doing this again. Let's think about what would happen if we take, starting at point B, another 5 books away from our consumer. And we asked them, now how many more movies do we have to provide you with to make you indifferent between bundle B and this new bundle? Well, one of the assumptions that we're going to be making here is that the more of something that you have, the less utility you get at the margin from having another unit. It's called the law of diminishing marginal utility. The less of something you have, the more utility you get at the margin from having a unit, and the more of something you have, the less utility you get at the margin from having another unit. This is why demand curves slope downwards. The idea there is that if you think about the example I use in class is eating at a buffet. What's the best bite at the buffet? Well, it's typically the first bite. And the second bite is good too. When you've had relatively few of something, you get a lot of utility at the margin from it. But as you continue to eat bites, each consecutive bite is making you less and less well off until you get to the point where you're taking that one of the last bites that you're going to take, and you're getting hardly any additional utility from those last bites. Okay? So the more of something you get, the less utility you get at the margin. Now what's happening here is the consumer as we take books away, they've got fewer and fewer books. And so as they have fewer and fewer books, they're going to be valuing them at the margin more highly. The less of something you have, the more marginal utility you get from it. So in order to make them just as well off when we take another 5 books away, we're going to have to compensate them with more movies than we had to compensate them right now, or right back here with. Here we had to give them 6 more movies. Now, when we take more books away, we're going to have to give them even more movies than before to leave them just as well off. Let's suppose that we have to give them, let's say, all the way up to 28 movies. That would be 5 books, 28 movies. That would be a bundle that we'll call bundle C. And if we were to take even more books away, as they get fewer and fewer books, they value them at the margin more highly than before, and we'd have to compensate them with even more movies. And so what you can see is that as we move down in this direction, if we were to connect these points, we've got 3 points that the consumer is indifferent between. If we were to connect those, what we would get is a nice curving object that looked something like this. And this curve would represent bundles that the consumer is indifferent between. The consumer doesn't care whether they're at point C or at point B or at point A or at some point up here that we could call point V. Okay? The consumer is indifferent between all of those points. We call this thing, that curve, we call an indifference curve. So an indifference curve represents all of the different bundles of movies and books that the consumer is indifferent between. Okay? So now this gives us an ability to say something about bundles up here to the northwest of point A. So what we can say is if we were to pick a bundle, so remember we were able to say anything about bundles to the northeast of A or the southwest of A. But it was hard for us without this indifference curve to say anything about bundles up here or down here. Now we can. Now we can say this bundle, the consumer would like the exact same amount as that bundle. We can also say that the consumer would prefer bundle A to this bundle right there. And the reason is that this bundle is down here to the southwest of that indifference curve. Okay? We can also say that the consumer would prefer this bundle to bundle A because that bundle is to the northeast of our indifference curve. So now that we've got the idea of an indifference curve, what we can do is we can kind of ignore all of these numbers. Let's just put, say, movies here and books. And let's just talk about the general idea of an indifference curve. I'm going to call this U bar because this is a curve that represents bundles that all give us the same amount of utility. So this indifference curve represents bundles that give us U bar utility. Let's call it U bar 1. If we were to think about an indifference curve that's to the northeast of that, call it U bar 2. This indifference curve would correspond to a higher level of utility. So we would say that U bar 2 is greater than U bar 1. The utility represented by this indifference curve is higher than the utility represented by this indifference curve. And we could think about another indifference curve that's down here. This one would represent lower levels of utility. Anything down here would represent even lower levels of utility. So the consumer's problem here is going to be to get the most well-being, to get the highest level of utility. So the consumer wants to reach an indifference curve that's farthest away from the origin because indifference curves that are higher up represent higher levels of utility. Okay? Let's briefly talk just for a second about some of the characteristics of these indifference curves. I'll just run through them. One of the characteristics, and these characteristics are not something I would ask you on a test necessarily. These are just to help you briefly understand why these things are shaped the way they are. So one of the main characteristics that we've talked about just a second ago is that indifference curves farther from the origin represent higher levels of well-being or higher levels of utility. Another one is that indifference curves will never cross. So you can never have an indifference curve cross another indifference curve. Okay? Let's talk about the last one. You're never going to have indifference curves that look like this. Because what this tells us is that the law of diminishing marginal utility does not hold. This says that the less of something you have, the less you like it, and the more of something you have, the more you like it. This says that the best bite at the buffet is the last one, and clearly we know that that's not true. Okay, so indifference curves are never going to look like this. They're never going to cross. Indifference curves, you might be wondering, could be linear. You could have indifference curves that look like that. We're not going to be messing with indifference curves that are linear. In this class, our indifference curves are always going to look like this. So those are some basic ideas as to why indifference curves look the way they do. So the goal of the consumer is to reach the highest indifference curve, the indifference curve that's farthest away from the origin. So what we need to do now is think about the slope of this indifference curve. The slope of the indifference curve is going to be represented. We're not going to go into why this is true, but the slope of the indifference curve, difference curve, we're going to call the marginal rate of substitution. Marginal rate of substitution. Typically abbreviated MRS, marginal rate of substitution. The marginal rate of substitution is simply going to be the ratio of the marginal utilities. So the marginal rate of substitution is going to be equal to the marginal utility of the good on the horizontal axis, in this case movies, divided by the marginal utility of the good on the vertical axis, in this case it would be books. So the slope of the indifference curve, the marginal rate of substitution, is going to be equal to the ratio of the marginal utilities, and we always are going to have the marginal utility of the good on the horizontal axis in the numerator. And that's exactly how everything has worked so far. If you think back to the picture of production possibilities frontier, we had the slope of the ISO value line was equal to the relative price ratio, and the price that was in the numerator corresponded to the good on the horizontal axis. Okay? So now let's think about what this means in terms of our production possibilities frontier. What we need to do is put the idea of this indifference curve together with the production possibilities frontier. One thing I was going to mention just a second ago that I kind of glossed over because I was going to show you these and I didn't think about it till just now. You can think about these indifference curves as being the exact same idea as a topographical map. So if you look at a topographical map, a topo map, then it represents elevation with lines that, so a topographical map of, say, a mountain would look something like this. And what it's representing there is elevation. These isobars that are inside correspond with higher levels of altitude. Well, this is the exact same idea. It's the exact same idea. Indifference curves that are farther away from the origin represent bundles, combinations of bundles that provide us with higher levels of utility. So the goal here, this is kind of like this portion right down there of that topographical map. The goal is to reach the indifference curve that's farthest away from the origin. So now I need to clear the board, and then we'll combine this with our production possibilities frontier, and then we'll be able to see the bundle that consumers actually are going to consume. All right, we're going to now represent the preferences of our economy, of the consumers in our economy. We're going to represent them with what we call a representative consumer. So we're going to pretend as if we can represent the preferences of all of our consumers in the economy with a single indifference curve. Now, if you were to go on and study microeconomics, you'd spend time, especially if you went to, say, graduate school, you'd spend time talking about the problems associated with what I'm about to do. And there are some problems with that. It's difficult to represent the preferences of an entire economy of people with a representative consumer. But we're going to do it because it's a good place to start. It's nice and simple. And at this point, we don't need to worry necessarily about the problems associated with what we're doing here. So I'm going to represent the preferences of everybody in our economy with a single set of indifference curves. So now let's think about the production point for our economy. So let's go back to how we identify the amount of each good that the economy is going to produce. Okay, so let's go back to using our quantity of cloth down here and our quantity of food. So we've got an economy in which we're producing cloth and food. We've got a production possibilities frontier that looks like that. We know that our economy is going to maximize the value of its production, so we can represent the value of its production with an ISO value line, and the economy is going to try to reach the highest ISO value line, which leaves us with a tangency between the production possibilities frontier and the ISO value line. And so we know that the economy is going to produce this combination of cloth. This is going to be production of cloth. Let's call it QC. Here's production of food, QF. So let's call that production point Q. Okay, so this is production. We've talked about this several times in this class. What we haven't done yet is talk about, well, what's the bundle that is actually going to be consumed? We have discussed the fact that what this line, this ISO value line represents, it represents combinations of cloth and food that all have the same value. And so we also discussed the fact that this represents the budget constraint for our economy. So it represents all of the bundles that can be consumed. Okay? So if we think about what this thing also represents, it's like the economy's budget constraint. Now, if you've had an intermediate micro class, you know exactly what we're about to do. We're going to put our indifference curves on there, and the economy is going to try to reach the highest indifference curve subject to its budget constraint. If you haven't, let's talk about it. If you haven't had your intermediate micro class yet, that's fine. What's going to happen here is that this line represents all of the possible consumption bundles. I'm going to extend it up here. So this economy, consumers in this economy can consume any of the bundles on or inside this ISO value line. Okay. Now clearly, we don't want to consume bundles in here because our goal is going to be to reach the highest indifference curve. We want to maximize utility. So we don't want to consume a bundle like this one because we could move to the northeast and consume more cloth and more food and have more utility. So let's suppose that when we put our indifference curves up here and we reach the highest one, let's suppose that that happens right, let's just say right there. We end up at a point of tangency right there. Let's call that D. We're going to use D to represent the actual bundle that is consumed by consumers in this economy. So this is the bundle that we are going to produce. This is the bundle that we're going to consume. And so if we look at what's happening here, let's call this let's call it the amount of cloth consumed and the amount of food consumed. So notice, compared to cloth, we're consuming less cloth than what we're producing. Here's how much cloth we're producing. Here's how much we're consuming. So this distance right here would be exports of cloth. This is how much, I should have called that D. Let's call that DF. This is the amount of food that we're producing, and this is the amount of food that we're consuming. So what's happening here is clearly we're consuming more food than what we're producing, so this distance is going to be imports of food. So this distance, exports. This distance, imports. So this economy, given what its set of indifference curves look like, this economy would export cloth and import food. Okay, so what's happening here is something that we've seen in other models. We just haven't used the indifference curves to identify it. We saw this with the farmer-rancher model, right, where the farmer and the rancher were going to produce at one bundle and consume at a different bundle. We just didn't talk much about how to figure out that consumption bundle. We talked a lot about how to figure out the production bundle. Okay? And we've done the same thing with the other models of trade that we've discussed. We've focused on the bundle that is produced in the economy, but we haven't really talked much about the bundle that ends up being consumed. But now that we've got these indifference curves, we can talk specifically about the consumption bundle. Now, our point of tangency between this ISO value line and this indifference curve didn't have to be up here. It could be that consumers in this economy like cloth more than they like food. So our point of tangency could have been down here, in which case they would import cloth and export food. So we could have had a situation, I won't put all of the details up there, but we could have had a situation where here's the tangency between the ISO value line and the production possibilities frontier, and once we draw the indifference curves for this economy, let's suppose that consumers really like cloth compared to food. It could have been that when we reach the highest indifference curve, the one farthest away from the origin, our tangency is over here. It depends on the preferences of the consumer. In this case, as I said, they would be importing. Would be the production of cloth. Here's consumption of cloth, so they would be importing. That's imports. Here's production of food. Here's how much food they're actually consuming, so that distance right there would be the exports of food. So whether or not the economy imports a good or exports that good depends upon its production point relative to its consumption point. Okay? What we need to do now is think about what happens when the relative prices change. So the slope of this thing, the slope of that ISO value line is the relative price of cloth to food. So what we need to do is we need to think about what happens when that changes. And remember, that would change when we allow this economy to trade with another economy. Okay? So let's think about clearing this board, and then we'll think about what happens when we change the relative price of cloth. Let's put up here a similar picture to the ones that we've been using. Let's continue with our cloth and food example. Let's suppose we have a production possibilities frontier. Let's look at our ISO value line, tangent to that PPF, someplace like that. We'll call that Q1. That's the production bundle that we're going to start with. Let's suppose that when we look at the tangency between this ISO value line and the indifference curve, let's suppose that it ends up being tangent, say right here. So we'll call that D1. That's the consumption bundle that we're going to start with. Remember that the slope of this ISO value line is the relative price of cloth. It's the price of cloth divided by the price of food. I'm going to put a negative out there. We're going to think about what happens if that relative price of cloth increases. Okay, so let's suppose the relative price of cloth increases. So we're going to be starting at Q1, D1 and increasing the relative price of cloth. So now when this ISO value line gets steeper, we're going to move along this production possibilities frontier and produce a higher amount of cloth than we did before. So let's draw another ISO value line. This is going to be an ISO value line that comes down and is going to be tangent, say right down here. So as the relative price of cloth increases, our economy produces a relatively higher amount of cloth to food than before. We've seen that before, right? That's why the relative supply curve slopes upward. But now let's think about how that's going to affect the consumers in the economy. So now notice that because this ISO value line is pivoted up like this, I'm going to extend it out here. Notice that the consumer, let's label the amount of utility that the consumers got U1. That's their initial amount of utility that they got. Notice that what's going to happen when the relative price of cloth increases is that this is going to allow our representative consumer in this economy to move to a higher indifference curve. We're going to move to a new point of tangency. We could call it D2. And that is going to occur at a higher level of utility. So given where we started and where the consumers, our representative consumer was initially consuming, this change in relative prices makes our consumer better off, right? So we reach a higher utility level. Higher level of utility. Let's think about the move from D1 to D2. Two things are happening there. We've got a change in relative prices. If you go back to even a principles of microclass, even a principles of macroclass, when we talk about demand and supply, you know that when price changes, quantity demanded is going to change, which is exactly what we're seeing right there. And the quantity demand change is going to be due to two different effects. There's going to be an income effect and a substitution effect. And so both of those things are happening. When the relative prices change, that creates an income effect that allows us to reach a higher indifference curve, but also notice that we're going to be substituting towards food and away from cloth when the relative price of cloth increases. So there's an income effect and a substitution effect. We're not going to worry about trying to separate those two things out. We're just going to recognize the fact that the move from D1 to D2 has two different effects combined into it. So now let's think about kind of the welfare implications of what's going on here. Okay, so let's think about our terms of trade and how changes in the terms of trade affect well-being. So if we have an increase in the relative price of cloth, okay, which is what we've had right here, the country, what we've seen is there are two possibilities. The country is better off if it exports cloth. Better off if it exports cloth. It's worse off, the country would be worse off if it exported food. Let's say exports food. Think about what would happen if our point of tangency between the indifference curve and the ISO value line was right there. Then when this relative price of cloth changes, it pivots this ISO value line down, and we would have to move to a lower indifference curve down here. So here we've got a country that was exporting cloth, And this change in its terms of trade made it better off because it exported cloth, okay? Not surprisingly. If we had a decrease in the relative price of cloth, or excuse me, the relative price of cloth. So if instead of that thing getting steeper, it got flatter, then what we would see is this country is better off if it exports food. Better off if it exports food. Worse off if it exports cloth. So this gives us a link between the country's terms of trade and whether or not it's going to be made worse off or better off if its terms of trade go up or down. Okay? So clearly what we want, let's put a kind of the general conclusion. A rise, an increase in a country's terms of trade, increases welfare or well-being. And vice versa. A decrease in a country's terms of trade decreases its well-being. What we need to do now is we need to put this together with another economy. Think about what happens when two countries trade. The nice thing is we've done all of the hard work. It'll be really quick to kind of put that together and see what happens to the well-being of the country. So that's what we'll do in our next video.